Well, this is our AP Euro final exam review. And our exam is just going to hit a few well-aimed highlights. You can't possibly have a comprehensive exam that talks about all the things we've talked about. In fact, think about the AP Euro exam. That's a 3 hour and 15-minute exam. And so the way I've designed this very short exam actually is that there's one stimulus basically that represents each of our 9 units that we've gotten into. So there's a total of 25 questions. So we're going to get in and get out of this test quite quickly. And there are some things to be ready for. So let's begin with Unit 1, the Renaissance and the Age of Discovery. And we've only got 2 basic questions about the Renaissance and the Age of Discovery. Number 1, what was the Columbian Exchange and how did it impact Europe? And what we need to understand about the Columbian Exchange and its impact on Europe is that it was huge, especially with the introduction of new crops to Europe and its later impact upon the agricultural revolution and the subsequent industrial revolution. And it made those 2 revolutions possible. So I'm just kind of moving up a bit, what were some of the economic changes in Europe as Europe transitioned into the modern age? Well, as Europe emerged, modern Europe emerged, economies grew, towns and trade grew, urbanization increased, wages began to increase over time. And of course, guilds were a big part of the economic life of a society. Guilds were often very influential as well as very exclusive. And wages increased, but you got to be careful because wages only made you better off if they weren't overtaken by price increases, especially price increases that resulted from inflation or critical shortages, like the case of a staple like grain. And we saw grain become very, very political numerous times. I can give you 2 examples. The French Revolution, price of bread was a major cause of the French Revolution. And look at England with the Corn Laws. That was huge as well. And so that is Unit 1. So we're going through this pretty quickly. Unit 2 was the Protestant Reformation. Couple of questions here. Number 1, what were the immediate issues that caused the Protestant Reformation? And when you think about these, it's quite a short list. The biggest one being, the most immediate one being, indulgences. Keep in mind, Martin Luther. Also keep in mind where he was teaching, the University of Wittenberg. 1517, he wrote the 95 Theses, criticized the Catholic Church, mostly for its doctrine regarding indulgences, but also he had some attacks for the wealth of the church and the corruption of the church. So how did the Catholic Church respond to the Protestant Reformation? Keep in mind the Council of Trent, which lasted from 1545 to 1563. Through the Council of Trent, the Catholic Church admitted that they needed to clean up their act, they needed to increase church discipline and training, they needed to get rid of corrupt church practices like simony, nepotism, pluralism, absenteeism. But at the same time, the Council of Trent made it very clear to the world that they were not going to compromise one iota of Catholic doctrine. Kind of reminds you in a way of the NRA. We are not budging on anything. And so what were the long-term results of the Protestant Reformation over the course of the rest of the 16th and 17th centuries? And you had things like secular princes and rulers who could now decide whether they wanted themselves, and by extension their kingdoms, to be Catholic or Protestant. They could be Lutheran. They might even choose to be Calvinist. Look at Henry of Navarre. Of course, he had to relinquish Calvinism in order to be accepted as King of France, but the point is, he was a Calvinist ruler first. And so there also emerged radical fringe groups like the Anabaptists, who taught that you had to be baptized to be saved, and you had to be old enough to understand what was going on with your baptism when it was happening. And if you didn't have those things, you didn't have those conditions, your baptism didn't count, and you better get your baptism redone soon because the world, the end of the world is imminent. That was another Anabaptist belief. Also, think about all the religious violence that resulted from all of this. The Schmalkaldic Wars, French Wars of Religion, which killed 3 million people, and the 30 Years' War, which killed 8 million people. Moving on to Unit 3, Absolutism and Constitutionalism. So what do you know about one absolutist in particular, Peter the Great? There were numerous absolutists. We could talk for hours about this unit. In fact, I did talk for hours about this unit. But we're going to narrow it down to just one representative figure, and that is Peter the Great. We could have done Louis XIV. We could have done one of the Fredericks. But we're going to do Peter the Great. What do we know about him? Keep in mind that we learned a lot about Peter the Great. He was a Russian. He wanted to modernize and westernize Russia. He took an 18-month-long tour of Western Europe, learned a lot about countless pieces of science and technology, and he met and hired tons of people, experts, to come back to Russia and help him modernize it. He built St. Petersburg. He defeated a bona fide European power in Sweden. And one of the things that typified Peter the Great as an absolutist was that he had to contend with both his nobles, the boyars, and his church, the Eastern Orthodox Church. He forced his boyars to update their dress and their grooming. He forced them to go to social events and interact with women, and forced them to get educations and use those educations in service of the state. So those are all some things from absolutism and constitutionalism, specifically with regard to Peter the Great. Unit 4 was scientific, philosophical, and political developments, and it began with who were the Enlightened Absolutists. Well, and that kind of morphs Unit 3 and Unit 4. It kind of shows us where the two kind of overlap a little bit. There were absolute rulers who wanted to bring Enlightenment principles to the way that they ran and governed their kingdoms. And these included such ideas as, let's say, increased education, civil liberties, emancipation of serfs, scaling back of religious holidays, more professional government, seeing themselves as perhaps the first servant of the state rather than the first master of the state. And Enlightenment ideas didn't keep Enlightenment philosophers from having very elitist notions, and they saw the dissemination of their Enlightenment principles as a top-down process, not a bottom-up process. In other words, if you want to influence society, their argument would go, start with its most powerful and its most privileged. And that view was not entirely without merit. There's a trustworthy rule of thumb that I'll leave with you as we kind of say goodbye, after our year together. And that is this. If you want to see who is causing the problems in our society, any society really, don't look down. Look up. Don't look down at the people in our society who have very little wealth, very little power or influence or even a voice in our society. They don't have the means, they don't have the power, they don't have the access to generate the corruption and the chaos and the inequity and the injustice that we see and witness in our society. It's not those people, it's the people at the top who have the wealth and the power and the status and the esteem and the acclaim and the access to our politicians who are able to exert their influence upon our laws, our policies, our institutions in ways that will continue to benefit them with more and more advantages and privileges at the expense of ordinary people in countless ways. People we recognize as enlightened absolutists would be people like, for example, Frederick the Great of Prussia and Catherine the Great of Russia, Maria Theresa of Austria and her son Joseph II. And as a matter of fact, Frederick and Catherine were both very close to possibly the prince of Enlightenment philosophers, Voltaire. Would we classify Peter the Great as an enlightened absolutist? No, for the simple reason that he was a bit too early. He died in 1725, and at that time Voltaire was only about 29 or 30 years old, so they weren't what you would call contemporaries. But that didn't stop Voltaire from trying to characterize Peter the Great as one in a book that he wrote about Russia about 3 decades after Peter the Great died. And so what were some of the features of this age of enlightenment that we see? Keep in mind that the Enlightenment embraced and amplified the scientific revolution. It said, question every single belief that you've ever taken for granted, whether that belief had to do with religion or culture or government, law, justice, education, economics, child rearing. That was a big deal. If you're going to change society, that's where you need to start. You name it. And remember what Immanuel Kant said, sapere aude, right? Dare to know. Enlightened absolutism aside, the Age of Reason was particularly critical of absolute monarchy and the antiquated and false assumptions that supported absolute monarchy, assumptions like the divine right of kings and hierarchy and feudalism, which was still alive and well in their time. And so the Enlightenment thinkers were out to change all of society for the better, right down to the people in it. We're not just going to change our institutions. We're actually going to go inside people and change them. And it was going to use scientific methods that had been developed in the scientific revolution to make sense of our physical world, and apply those same methods to the world of human affairs and human institutions and human development. If natural laws that governed our physical world could be discovered, that gave us Newtonian physics that defines the universe as a totally reliable and consistent machine, then maybe there are natural laws out there that define the social world. And if we could identify and harness those laws, then the possibilities for our society were limitless. And if there were such natural laws, maybe people also had natural rights as well. And that was the Enlightenment. So let's narrow all that down to one example. And we could choose anybody, but let's just choose Adam Smith, the economist, who methodically dismantled both mercantilism and the guild system in his book, Wealth of Nations. Mercantilism relied especially upon the exploitation of colonies. Britain, France, and Spain all had large colonial systems, whereas Prussia and Austria, they had none. They had no colonies. And yet, were the non-colonial countries being dominated by the colonial countries? No, Prussia and Austria were both great powers, extremely powerful. And they didn't benefit from the exploitation of colonies, but they also didn't have the expense of maintaining those colonies. And they didn't have to worry about losing them either. And that brings us to Unit 5, Conflict, Crisis, and Reaction. And we've got one person that we really want to concentrate on, and that's Napoleon. We could have concentrated on a lot of French Revolution, and we did talk a lot about the French Revolution, but let's narrow that down to just Napoleon. What do we know about him? He was an emperor, military genius. He was a colonial mercantilist and a conqueror of a huge European empire. And one of the most lasting things that Napoleon did was to spread nationalism throughout Europe. The years-long French Revolution had fostered strong nationalism in France. The French were proud of their revolution. They were proud of their republic that had been created by that revolution. They were proud of the Enlightenment ideals that had inspired it. They had fought against much of Europe for years with the intention of spreading these uniquely French ideals abroad. And when Napoleon came to power, he leveraged that French nationalism, that nationalist feeling, to basically conquer the rest of Europe and establish his grand empire. For example, the abolition of serfdom and the Napoleonic Code, and what many call the last enlightened despot, Napoleon rolled through Europe, toppling governments, installing his own family members as he went, and his spread of Enlightenment reforms through military conquest popularized nationalism throughout Europe, specifically in two ways that we can identify. First, Napoleon's authoritarian rule by means of the French bureaucracy and the installment of his own relatives in place of these countries' rightful rulers created nationalistic resentment among the peoples that he dominated. And then secondly, at the very same time, these people that he dominated were also impressed and inspired by Napoleon's use of media and propaganda to stimulate French nationalism and enhance French power. If Napoleon could accomplish that for France, then maybe they could do the same thing in their own countries if they could just get rid of Napoleon first. And so that brings us to Unit 6. After Napoleon was defeated, we go to industrialism and its effects. And there are some definitions that we want to know. We want to be sure to be familiar with these. For example, can we define the following? Conservatism. How can we describe it? What concrete words can we use to know that we're talking about conservatism? It's authoritarian, it's pro-monarchy, it's pro-aristocracy. It believes that people can't really improve themselves. You can't make people better. People have no capacity to become better people, and they need strong guidance, and they will forever. Conservatism is anti-individual rights. You don't need those things. And individual rights, they just get people into trouble, so you don't need them. It's anti-constitutionalism, and it's definitely anti-democratization. And moving on, it's kind of a spectrum that we're going along here. So we got liberalism. What can we say about that? Liberalism believes in expanding the franchise, the democracy, to include those who have no nobility, but who do have wealth and property and power, but going no further than that as far as democratization goes. Liberalism is pro-business, it's pro-industry, it's pro-free market, it's pro-free trade, it's pro-property. But liberalism is also anti-union, anti-regulation, because unions and regulations, these things artificially mess with the market, and we're pro-free market, so we're not going to be for unions, we're not going to be for regulation. And that brings us to this broad thing called republicanism. Republicans believe in getting rid of monarchy entirely and replacing it with a constitution and with representative government. And this republicanism encompasses a wide spectrum of ideologies. There are lots of different kinds of republics when you think about it, including, there's moderate republicanism, there's utopian socialism, there's radical socialism, and Marxism, and even feminism. And Republicans believe in universal male suffrage. Some even go so far as to believe in women's suffrage. So, like we said, one of the things that fits under this republicanism umbrella, and really all three of these next items do, is utopian socialism. There were several types of socialism. You've got utopian socialism, you've got radical socialism, and you've even got Marxism. So what's the difference among the three of them? Socialists, or utopian, socialists as a group, let's start there, believe in social equality, including gender equality quite often. They also believe that economic planning should be at the community level and not at the individual level. In other words, the planning shouldn't be done by the movers and shakers of the world, the entire community should be involved in economic planning. Economic planning should be the work of the commune or the city or the state or the nation, etc. And utopian socialists in particular had these grand schemes for creating model, precisely planned societies, and we named several of those. And all of their efforts actually wound up failing. So anarchism sounds so threatening. It sounds so chaotic. But what do anarchists actually believe? Well, anarchism has an inherent distrust of all authority and all political systems and all institutions. And it believes that states themselves should actually just be abolished because we don't need states, and that people should be organized into these loose associations. It doesn't buy into the sanctity of property and ownership like liberalism does. And it believes that workers are the source of all wealth and that profit is actually stolen from the workers by, you guessed it, property owners. And so in that sense, you can kind of think of Marxism as something of a scientific kind of anarchism, or maybe a historical anarchism. What's the difference between Marxism and anarchism? You can already see that Marxism is kind of the next step in anarchism. And so the thing that makes Marxism different is that Marxism takes anarchism a step further with the introduction of class consciousness, and class struggle. You got the bourgeoisie. There's only two kinds of people in the world: the bourgeoisie, the property owners, the capitalists, and the proletariats, the workers of the world. You're either one or the other. And the bourgeoisie exploit the workers, and they pocket what's called surplus value that's produced by the proletariats. Surplus value is the difference between what they produce, and difference in value between what they produce and what they're paid. And there's going to be a class struggle ending in violent revolution because these capitalists just don't know when to quit exploiting. And in this violent revolution, the bourgeoisie are going to be overthrown. And then society is going to be a worker's paradise with no class. I mean, when there's only one class, what does class become? There's going to be no class. There's going to be no property. You won't miss the property because there's also going to be no scarcity. And so that's what Marxism believes. And so that brings us to Unit 7, 19th Century Perspectives and Political Developments. And we only have one main question here, and that was, what was the main objective of Otto von Bismarck's foreign policy? And you may be a little bit surprised about this. Bismarck was, as we might remember, not really that interested in colonies per se. Don't forget what Bismarck said when Eugen Wolff showed him a map of Africa and tried to persuade him to have more colonies. He said to Eugen Wolff, your map of Africa is very nice, but my map of Africa lies in Europe. Here's Russia, here is France, here we are in the middle. That is my map of Africa. Because Bismarck's highest foreign policy objective, his most crucial one, his most vital one, his most important one, was isolating and distracting France, who he knew hated Germany because of the Franco-Prussian War. If German colonial aims served that purpose, then Bismarck was all for it. Otherwise, he didn't see colonies as being that important. And so that's Unit 7. I told you this would be fast. Unit 8, we basically have one question, and we see it right here. Instead of highlighting the major parts of this period like World War I, the Great Depression, World War II, we're just going to focus on totalitarian dictators, specifically the policies of one totalitarian dictator, Joseph Stalin. So what were Joseph Stalin's Marxist-Leninist policies, and what did they accomplish for the Soviet Union? And what do we know about Stalin? Stalin was a diehard communist and at the same time, unlike Trotsky and unlike Lenin, a diehard nationalist. Stalin felt no need at all to seek cooperation with other nations. He was also quite paranoid, And some of his most famous policies included getting rid of Lenin's new economic policy, which allowed for small scale, or what we could call petty capitalism. One type of petty capitalist who suffered horribly was a group of small scale property owning peasant farmers called the kulaks, Kulaks. Stalin made them into the enemy class who were hoarding large sums of money that could be used to fund progress. And Stalin used propaganda to vilify the kulaks, and he used collectivization of Russia's agricultural sector largely to punish the kulaks, but even more broadly to provide food for the cities in order to feed the urban workers who were engaged in rapid industrial modernization and rapid industrial expansion. And those people that were in those cities, building those factories, working on this industrial expansion, they needed to be fed. And collectivization, which was the forced consolidation of individual peasant farms into large state-controlled agricultural factories, was Stalin's way of accomplishing that. Now, economically, you could call this system of collectivization a disaster because millions of peasants starved to death because the food that they grew was being confiscated and sent to the cities to feed the city dwellers who were expanding the USSR's industry. But if you don't care about the peasants, if you really just care about industrial growth, if because of your paranoia, you see the peasants as a potential political threat anyway because of their large numbers, then maybe collectivization wasn't that much of a disaster for you. And in fact, industrial output grew by 250% in 5 years, which brings us to Stalin's 5-year plans. Stalin had 3 5-year plans between 1928 and 1941. And these 5-year plans, each of them were really about 3 things. Number 1, industrial output. Number 2, improved transportation. And number 3, transforming the people into a socialist people. That was what was important to him. The kulaks really suffered under Stalin's Great Purge, which went from 1937 to 1938. The Great Purge was a lot of things. It was police surveillance, it was imprisonment, it was executions, and between 950,000 and 1.2 million people died. Many different people were purged: peasants and ethnic minorities and Communist Party members and government officials and army officers and intelligentsia, the educated. But the biggest part of all of that was the kulak operation. Kulaks and ethnic minorities made up about 90% of the executions and about 75% of the gulag imprisonments. And finally, we have the Cold War and contemporary Europe. What were the economic conditions like in Europe directly after World War II? And what we've got was this. What we see is that in spite of the Marshall Plan, which was an enormous success, as we know, economic conditions in Europe were extremely harsh after World War II. Countries didn't recover for many years after the war. One of the reasons was the immense cost of the war. Countries like Britain had committed literally all of their resources just to defeating the Nazis. And rationing and rebuilding went on for years. And in fact, poorer cities in Britain, like Liverpool, had unrepaired bomb damage for years. And there's a relationship between that and decolonization. Let's see if you see it, because we've got this last question. What was decolonization? Decolonization, as we studied, was the process of former European colonies gaining their independence in Asia and in Africa. And this was a long story that involved, we talked about Britain, we talked about France, the Netherlands, Belgium, Portugal. Britain was particularly unwilling to give up its colonies. It didn't give up India until 1947, and they actually crushed an independence movement in Kenya in the 1950s. And you could see why when you look at the economic conditions that they were suffering after the war. They really depended upon these colonies for their resources and for their manpower. Britain desperately needed immigrants to lessen their extreme labor shortage. And a great example of this was the arrival of 500 Jamaicans on a ship called the Windrush in 1948. Jamaicans came to Britain from Jamaica for literally decades. Many of these Jamaicans initially had actually served in the British military during the war. And their arrival, and I've got a YouTube link to kind of fill you in on this and give you some images, it was a celebrated moment. And you can see this on YouTube. So anyway, that's our review. I hope you find it helpful. I hope you find it useful. And I hope it gets you a fantastic grade on this last test that we're going to have.